Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Auxis Corporate Performance Series webinar, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Outsourcing. My name is Yazan Arroyo, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Auxis. Auxis is a very different consulting and outsourcing firm comprised of former industry professionals who don't act like traditional consultants. Offering a customized, real-world, results-oriented approach, we become ingrained in our clients' culture and vision and truly dedicated to their success. Our depth of experience allows us to operate under a very different leverage model and maintain a focus on customization, flexibility, and bottom-line results at a very competitive cost structure. At this point, I would like to introduce our featured speaker, Eric Liebross. Eric is the Senior VP of Operations for Auxis, and he manages our business process outsourcing practice. He's worked with many companies to help them determine if outsourcing is right for their businesses and establish Auxis' methodology to migrate organizations to our outsourcing center in Costa Rica. Before we begin, let me remind all participants we welcome your questions. Please submit them in your webinar panel at any time. We'll address your questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Eric. Eric?
Thank you, Yaslin, and welcome everyone to the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Outsourcing. Today's webinar will provide insight into the best practices and current industry trends around outsourcing, and we're going to be using Stephen Covey's business primer, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, as a reference point. We will discuss what's happening in the industry today and provide some feedback from customers based on recent industry surveys. Then we'll apply the 7 habits to the industry and offer some of our own perspectives on how outsourcing can and should work to establish a strong collaborative operating model that brings both high performance and good value to businesses. To start, let's review some recent industry trends. Overall, outsourcing continues to grow in acceptance, but the model is evolving. It clearly has established itself in the business community with not only large businesses taking advantage of outsourcing services, but small and mid-market companies now being strongly represented as well. As you can see from some of the statistics represented on this slide, a large percentage of large companies and a growing percentage of smaller and mid-market companies are leveraging outsourcing, and the plan is to continue to expand the growth of outsourcing within their business operations. Cost savings is still a major focus, but the perspective is shifting from labor savings to also include operational performance, efficiency, and scale as the benefits that companies are looking for. And in today's world, much of business operations is cross-functional, as various activities go across many departments and services. As a result, outsourcing is not an all-or-nothing proposition anymore, and a hybrid operating model has emerged, with businesses leveraging global business services, which is the new industry term for shared services and outsourcing that incorporate non-domestic components. They're using this model to segment transactional and strategic functions and establishing a centralized governance model overseeing the entire operation. A recent study by KPMG and HFS Research highlights this emerging business model. A majority of companies across the full cross-section of business demographics are looking to increase their use of outsourcing and/or shared services, with only 16% of companies indicating that they want to increase their in-house operating footprint. A hybrid internal and external operating model is taking hold, and clearly companies are looking to focus their activities on those that are core to their business. As you can see, most of the business functions that are currently being outsourced are the more traditional back-office activities such as payroll, accounts payable, general accounting, and others. These transactional types of activities are certainly a good place to start as compared to the more strategic functions that are more core to your business, probably more complex, and critical to business performance, and therefore more difficult to migrate. That being said, many strategic functions such as analytics, financial planning and analysis, and management reporting are being outsourced as well. The decision to outsource a function requires a true evaluation of its complexity, its risk, and its strategic role in your business before you decide to make the leap into that world. And as for the functions that are being outsourced, much of it is going offshore, with IT, finance, and human resources the leading areas that are moving to non-domestic locations. Offshore, which is defined as a long distance from the source with travel time and time zone concerns, is still the leading non-domestic destination, but nearshore, defined as closer to the source destinations, are emerging. For the U.S., Asia is considered an offshore destination led by such locations as India, China, and the Philippines, and in Latin America and the Caribbean are considered nearshore destinations led by such countries as Costa Rica, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. Another KPMG survey highlighted the leading benefits that businesses are seeing in the outsourcing market, led by a greater access to innovative technologies. Companies are looking not just for labor savings today, but also looking for improved automation and technologies to drive business performance, and it's an expectation that this will be part of an outsourcing model that's being implemented. A second factor that businesses are looking for is the ability to gain access to emerging markets. A nice side benefit of going into a foreign market, whether it's through shared services or even as an outsourcer, is to establish your presence in those markets, and it opens the door to these emerging consumer markets as well as the operations that exist there. Closely aligned with this are the improving economic conditions and increased customer demand, which help fuel the need for broader markets for goods and services. And lastly, the ability to access global talent pools is another benefit that companies are seeing from the emergence of the global business services market. This is really a function of more than talent, but also of workforce performance and motivation. As many jobs that are being outsourced not only for the cost savings, but also typically because these areas are often underperforming within the client organization. And when these jobs go offshore, often the workforce performance and motivation tends to increase from the staff that's working in those environments. It's what we call the front of the house mentality. You tend to see more of a customer service orientation in those type of operations than you will have in your internal organization. But the survey also showed the schizophrenia of today's economy, as many of the same factors that were considered positive trends and benefits were also considered negative trends. Yes, there's a larger global talent pool, but there are also concerns as to whether the available talent is up to the job. While the economy is rebounding, there's a lack of confidence in its continued long-term trends. Emerging markets also means emerging competition, as offshore destinations are now becoming players in the same products and services arena as the companies that are looking to those markets from other locations. And lastly, and certainly we all, I think, recognize this to some extent, there's clearly a lack of confidence in the government's ability to address economic and political issues that have hampered the recovery and growth. Certainly the stalemate that we see in the houses of Congress is a strong example of some of the issues that are affecting the overall growth of the economy. But despite these still challenging economic conditions, the KPMG survey reports that the outsourced providers are not really feeling additional pricing pressures, which they were in the early stages of the recession back in 2008 to 2010. I bring this point up because I think it's important to understand that what people are looking for out of outsourcing is not necessarily just constantly to reduce price. So what you see is outsourcing customers are saying that while cost savings is still a major concern, the focus is shifting from purely financial benefits to broader operational and performance benefits. And they're looking for value-added services from the outsourcing providers, such as increased automation, reporting, analytics, as well as a more flexible operating model that can adapt to changing economic conditions. So while cost is important, it's not the only thing that people are looking for. Perhaps one reason that companies are looking at more than cost savings is the realization that the savings that have been achieved may be less than what was originally anticipated. As you can see, in all cases, a higher level of savings was anticipated than was realized. The majority of companies were able to achieve savings in the 10 to 20% range, while a smaller group, about 23%, were able to achieve savings in the 21 to 40% range. The cost savings are still significant, but in the end, companies are looking for more than that. They're looking for other benefits besides cost savings. So how does this affect the satisfaction that they feel with outsourcing? Well, most customer surveyed were found to be satisfied with the quality and value that they were receiving from outsourcing. So this clearly shows that outsourcing today is more than about cost savings, and as we've seen its place in business operations continue to grow, the model is changing, with a hybrid in-house outsourced model emerging as the optimal choice for most companies. In the next few slides, I'd like to take you through the results of an annual survey published by KPMG and HFS Research, which focuses on the customer's perspective on what they're looking for and the key challenges that they're facing and their experiences and how to make outsourcing work. The top 10 desired business outcomes indicates that cost is still an important factor. but the ability to leverage these services to improve decision-making through increased operational visibility and analytics, improved operational performance, standardization, flexibility. All these factors were almost equally as important as cost savings, as you can see from this chart. Cost is still king, but there's a lot of other factors that people are looking for out of outsourcing. And what we've seen is that in the end, you need to have a business case, but there needs to be a strong reason to make this happen beyond just cost savings. Other cultural factors come into play as well, as companies are looking at global business services as a way to increase collaboration across the business and drive better accountability and control. This almost seems counterintuitive, as one of the concerns that we often hear expressed by many people is losing operational control and visibility through this type of approach. Yet experienced users of these services clearly show that they're leveraging the platform to improve in these areas. So obviously there's an additional benefit to be gained from this in helping your organization work more effectively across multiple units. The top 10 challenges to making work highlights a mix of cultural and executional concerns. On the cultural side, there are many concerns that people have expressed about senior management's commitment and understanding of the benefits in the process. Other common areas include a fear of rocking the boat, as well as internal resistance and the organization's general fear of losing power and control. So a lot of these cultural issues are embedded in the organization, and many people feel that without a strong commitment and strong dedication from management, as well as an ability to bring this message out to the organization, it's a big challenge to making outsourcing work. On the executional side, many of the challenges were related to the ability of the organization to adapt to change. The common theme that we hear from many business executives. Change management is also often a very difficult aspect in any part of business operations, and making these type of changes is usually the biggest challenge to making it work. Outsourcing is certainly no difference from that type of change that's occurring. Other changes are more related to the type of model that's being implemented, with a concern about the operating vision and a focus on cost savings only, as well as the lack of investment in the operation to drive cost savings. So again, what you're seeing is people are concerned about not only the type of model, but also the fact that they really do want more value out of it than just cost savings. When these same executives were asked what is needed to make it work, it can be summarized in 4 categories. A commitment to the process, a focus on more than just cost savings, strong leadership internally and externally, which is closely aligned with the commitment comment, and investment in tools and talent, both needed to drive performance and increase value. All of these factors apply to any kind of operating model that's implemented, whether it's a captive shared services model or an outsourcing model. There needs to be a strong commitment of all parties involved, and in the case of outsourcing, there needs to be a strong collaborative partnership with the service provider. In the next few slides, we're going to take a look at what it takes to establish an effective outsourcing model using the 7 habits as a frame of reference. And now for the 7 habits of highly effective outsourcing. Number 1, be proactive. Take initiative and be responsible for your actions. A business needs to decide, is outsourcing for us? Which means you need to fully understand the benefits, the challenges, and the process that it will take to execute. If the answer is yes, then you can't be half pregnant. You need to commit to the process, actively engage with your service provider in the planning, design, and implementation, and you need to realize that once the process is migrated, your involvement doesn't end. You're going to need to stay engaged and create a collaborative operational approach. From the service provider perspective, you need to implement a model that is manageable for all parties. And simply meaning from a service provider, it means that you can effectively deliver it. You should establish service levels and performance monitoring that helps both parties understand what's going on and quickly address any issues and concerns. And just as important, if you take over a poorly designed process, it's your job to improve it. Taking over a bad process without a plan to improve it will just move that poor process to another location, and then it becomes your problem and not their problem any longer. A focus on performance and improvement needs to be embedded into the operating model. Another important aspect of being proactive is understanding what it takes to make change happen. It's one thing to be proactive without a full vision about what's involved, but you need to truly understand. And as you can see from this chart, change takes time, and the size and complexity of the change adds to the effort involved in completing it. I like to show this chart to prospective clients to have them understand the process that's involved. There is obviously a time frame and its level of effort that's needed to implement a model, and the more complex, the larger, the more in scope, the more locations, all of these factors come into play to extending the time it takes to implement. Understanding the effort, understanding the complexity helps you to better manage it and manage for it, and to manage the risks that are inherent in the process. Both the service provider and its client needs to work closely on planning for the migration, and a clearly thought out process is required with commitment from both parties. This busy chart that you're seeing here is something that you could kind of look at on your own to get a better understanding of some of the risks and some of the mitigation strategies around it, but I'd like to summarize a few key points that come out of this. There needs to be a clear alignment of outsourcing with business strategy. For example, don't outsource something that you consider core to your business unless you're confident that the process is bulletproof. One example I often like to cite is the example of accounts payable. When you're talking to a client, that's traditionally one of the first areas they look to outsource. It tends to be transactional, not core, not complex, a relatively simple process. It just needs to work within the business rules that are established around it, and is typically the first place you go to look for outsourcing. However, there are some businesses where accounts payable has a much more important role in the organization and how it operates. For example, a distribution-oriented company that's involved in, for example, drop shipment of products to clients, where you're selling a product to a customer, but the product is being shipped directly from the vendor. All of a sudden, accounts payable takes on a much more complex and critical role to your business. You're affecting sales, you're affecting customer service, you're affecting revenue recognition, you're affecting the ability to manage inventory. All of these things get affected when you're in an environment like that. So in that case, is accounts payable the right place to start? It may be and it may not be. You have to look at how buttoned down the process is, how well established it is, and what's the complexities, and what are the risks if it fails. So you have to plan for that, and you need to decide, is that the right place to start? Another important factor is making sure that the scope and the requirements are fully understood and includes not only an as-is operating model, meaning what you do today, but how it will work in an outsourced operation, meaning how it's going to work there, and what are the interactions between the two organizations. You need to get alignment on the operating model with the functional business users, unless there's some reason that this cannot be done. I've had a recent example of a client who transitioned a process to us, and it was a very problematic process for them. And what they basically told me was, I'd rather you figure it out than continue to work with my internal organization who's basically failing at it. I gulped and said, okay, let's do it. It was not necessarily the way I'd like to take it on, because here I'm taking on a bad process, and I'm taking it on with a lot of time to plan for it or truly understand it. And I explained to my client that what that means is that you're giving me a get-out-of-jail-free card, and if something happens in the first few months while we're trying to understand and stabilize the process, you need to understand that this is going to take time for us to get under control, and we need to be on the same page around that. Well, I had to use the get-out-of-jail-free card a few times during that process, but ultimately we got through it and we were able to manage it effectively. The client had confidence in our ability to take over a troubled process and quickly learn it, but it's certainly not the way I would recommend starting, and it's not the way I necessarily like to do it, but in this case, there was a level of trust established and a long-standing business relationship that we needed to cooperate with them on. So again, critical to have a collaborative approach involved. Another important factor is there a clearly defined and measurable business case? Often there are assumptions of cost savings, but not all of the factors that are involved in the business case are clearly defined and understood. It's imperative to make sure that the business case is solid and can be measured afterwards. As an end client, you want to understand what your opportunities are and make sure that those opportunities are fully available and fully realized. I've seen it go both ways. I've seen business cases that were missing a lot of components and the savings was understated. I've seen a lot of cases where the values were overstated because they truly didn't have an understanding of their cost or how things worked. It's also important for the service provider to get a good handle on this type of data as well, because at the end, when you're measuring your success of this operation, that's one of the factors that everybody looks at. So, in the case of a customer that's providing you with payroll data and saying, okay, here's your baseline to measure cost savings, that can work, but you also need to look at some of the other factors that come into play. Things like the use of temporary staff or seasonal staff, the cost of overtime when it's required. All of these things need to come into play within an operation when you're looking at that business case, and make sure that you all understand the benefits and the values, and make sure that it's something that's true and maintainable. Lastly, managing the risks includes understanding all of the key components, which may include things like technology, regulatory, and compliance concerns. It's not necessarily just about the process and the functions that are being done in the transactions that need to occur. It's also about some of these other factors. And when you're doing a migration, something as simple as testing the technology, testing the connectivity, testing the controls and the handoffs that are being put in place up front will go a long way to resolving issues later. Number 2, begin with the end in mind. You need to understand what you want to accomplish. In the case of outsourcing, is it about cost savings? Is it about efficiency? Is it about performance improvement, compliance, all of the above? We had a client recently make the move because of business continuity concerns, wanting to have another location that would support them in the event of a natural disaster such as a hurricane here in Florida. There are many reasons why you would want to outsource, but too often the business drivers are not clear and are not aligned throughout the organization. That message needs to be brought throughout the organization and it needs to be a consistent message that everybody understands, and if not embraces, at least accepts. And very often this is not done effectively, and it can be a problem with how this model gets implemented. Another key factor in understanding your readiness to adapt to this kind of change, is understanding your readiness to adapt to this kind of change. A recent article from KPMG highlighted the 6 key factors that determine the organization's maturity and the ability to adapt to this kind of change. The first one was location. So an organization that is a single location or has a heavily centralized operation, it's going to be a much simpler operation to move to outsourcing. One that's more geographically diverse, has a lot of operations, heavily decentralized, and doesn't have consistent operations across those various locations will be much more complex and also lack some of the organizational maturity and ability to adapt to outsourcing. So understanding that going in is an important factor, and understanding how to mitigate that is an important factor. Standardization was the second one highlighted by KPMG. And basically this is saying, are the business operations fairly standardized, or are they heavily customized and exception-based? A standardized process across multiple business units, for example, is a much simpler, less complex, and more mature approach to migrate to an outsourcing model. When you have operations that are heavily customized, heavily exception-based, and different from location to location or business unit to business unit, it becomes that much more difficult to adapt. So one of the goals of outsourcing should be to try to standardize as much as possible and give yourself a common platform to work from. Similarly, process orientation is another important consideration. Is the business process-oriented, or is it more ad hoc? A process-oriented business is one that understands that there's a series of activities that need to occur with the proper tools, people, processes, and controls in place, and they establish guidelines around that. More ad hoc organizations tend to be a little bit more dysfunctional and fall lower on the organizational maturity scale, and it makes it a more difficult process to adapt to outsourcing. Commercial orientation. Is the business bottom line focused? What are you trying to accomplish out of this? What do you really need to get to? If you have a strong commercial proposition around outsourcing and it's going to support the growth of the business and the direction of the business, it's going to be a lot easier to make happen than it would be if you were if you're not really clear on where you are as a business. And while everybody assumes every business is bottom line focused, a lot of cases that may get lost in the shuffle. Pace of change, this is another key one. How well has the business adapted to change in the past? We all go through change. Some of us adapt and adopt to change better than others. I myself, I always tell my wife, the next change that I want is taking me underground. I don't really like to move. I don't like change, and yet I live in a business of change. What I counsel people when I talk to them is look at how you have handled change in the past, and it's going to be a good indicator of how you're going to handle change in the future. And if you're not if you haven't handled change in the past well, doesn't mean you can't do it. It means you need to properly plan for it and figure out ways to address the issues that occurred before. Lastly, service portfolio. How broad is the scope, and how integrated and complex are the functions and the activities that you're going to be deploying? A broad scope, many functions, many activities is going to be one that is going to be harder to migrate than one that's a little more narrow and touches less areas. That's another key aspect of this is in today's business, as we previously discussed, many areas of business touch each other and have an effect on each other. And just stripping out one piece of it often can result in problems in another area. So the understanding the scope and the service portfolio and what's involved in all of it is a critical aspect. These 5 lessons learned are based on interviews with business executives who have gone through the process of migrating to outsourcing and have come out the other side with a better operating model. So all of them are important factors to consider when looking at driving business value in outsourcing, and I thought I would share them with you. Align operations and delivery. The companies that have the most effective strategy around sourcing or outsourcing align all aspects of delivery with operations. What that basically means is you need to not just do something in a vacuum, but look at how the business operates as a whole and align all of it together. Focus on growth. A company should try to move away from just a pure cost savings initiative and focus on innovation and processes that drive revenue growth. This works 2 ways. One way is by moving some of the more transactional, tactical type of activities out of your operation. The expectation should be that your internal organization will focus on more higher value activities, will focus on growth, focus on some of the things that can drive the business forward. It also means that the service provider can be a player in this and can provide assistance either through innovation, process improvement, technology that they can deliver, or even just the experience they have in performing certain activities. Sometimes it helps to listen to what someone else has done in a process to understand the value of their experience. Support non-core activities. Basically, what this is saying is go beyond the pure transactional activities once trust has been established and push additional activities into the outsourcing environment to take advantage of, as we said before, some of the abilities, experiences, skill sets, and talent that's available within the organization. In our experience, we typically start with one area. We develop it, we establish the trust with our client, and then they start to move other areas to us as well. And it's proven to be a well-defined relationship because ultimately we become, as I mentioned before, a partner and not a vendor. And we look at what else we can bring to the table, and the client starts to look at us to do the same thing. Integrate global processes. Again, what this is basically talking about is when you have an organization that's diverse, that's spread, that has operations in multiple locations, and that may have non-standardized operations across multiple locations. The optimal way to drive value in outsourcing is to align them, is to integrate them, and to standardize them when at all possible. Yes, you have to account for geographic and other differences within the organization, but the best way to get efficient, the best way to lower your costs, and the best way to improve operations is to be as standardized as possible across multiple environments. And finally, provide data analytics. One of the big values that comes out of outsourcing is not just the work that's being performed, but typically what we see is a higher level of visibility over operations, more data, more information, more clarity around the transactional activity that's occurring. When you have that type of process in place, the next level down is to take that data and do a little bit more mining of it and analyzing and understanding it to give you a greater picture about what's happening in your business, both from a forward-thinking aspect as well as a day-to-day aspect. So increased operational visibility and increased data analytics is what is one of the side benefits that come out of outsourcing, and it helps to drive a lot of what you're trying to accomplish. Number 3, first things first, prioritize, plan, and execute. The transition to outsourcing needs careful planning between the service provider and the client organization, and clear communication is key. The business needs to communicate to the organization what's going on and who will be affected. And it's not just the affected employees, but also the departments and functions that interact with them. Sometimes even external people, such as vendors that may be interacting, need to understand what's changed in the process. Once you've made the decision to outsource, the rest of the organization needs to understand what is transitioning and how it's going to work under this new operating model. The scope and responsibilities need to be clearly defined and the handoffs understood and planned for. Issue response and escalation also needs to be well established. So communication across multiple different areas and how the operation will work are all important factors. From the service provider perspective, a solid transition plan is key. There needs to be a realistic time frame established, as we've previously talked about, one that accounts for all of the activities that are required. I've been involved in picking up the pieces of poor transitions, and it's not a pretty picture. You don't want to shortchange this process, and you need to understand the complexities that are involved. If you get off on the wrong foot, it's also very difficult to balance yourself afterwards. And I've seen cases where outsourcing transitions have been poorly defined, poorly executed, and the process blows up within a few months because both parties are not effectively working together. Proper transition planning and prioritizing what needs to be done and when are all key parts of this. Part of prioritizing and planning is understanding the real transactional volumes that exist and what to expect from an outsourcing relationship. Too often, businesses have very poor understanding and visibility over their transactional activity. Many myths and legends arise within the organizational performance or lack thereof. Truly understanding the activity levels within an organization needs to be part of the implementation process, as well as projecting activities within the future state operating model. Which brings us to the concept of benchmarking. Are industry benchmarks valuable data points to understand how an organization operates and how it should operate? Yes and no. Benchmarking without baselining can lead to unrealistic or distorted expectations. Baselining basically means you need to establish your starting point from a transactional activity perspective and then compare these to an industry benchmark. And the comparison needs to be apples to apples. Many operating environments are different, and a broad brush industry comparison can be unrealistic and counterproductive. So to effectively use benchmarking, you should follow these 4 steps. Number 1, be crisp and clear about the why. Benchmarking should not necessarily be the starting point. Benchmarking should be the goal. I've seen where customers go into a relationship and they say, oh, well, we're processing 100 transactions a day, but according to the industry standards, we should be processing 200 transactions a day. So therefore, I need you to agree to process 200 transactions a day. Frankly, that's a prescription for failure, because without understanding why you're not processing 200 transactions currently, you're putting an onus on a service provider who doesn't necessarily have the full understanding of your business or the ability to make the changes that need to take place. So benchmarking should be used as part of a continuous improvement cycle and a goal that you want to get to. You need to be transparent. There needs to be an open dialogue between both parties about how and when to use benchmarks. And if there's a large enough disparity, try to understand why and use it as a means for performance improvement. As we've just said, There may be a difference. Understand why that difference occurs and understand what it's going to take to get you there, and that should be a goal that you want to establish. Picking the proper type of benchmark is another important factor. There are many types of benchmarks. Typically you see some that are transactional, meaning they're volumetric based, number of invoices processed, number of calls handled, versus cost-oriented type of benchmarks, such as cost to process an invoice, cost per line item, revenue per call. These types of cost-oriented benchmarks are well established as well. Either one can bring value. You need to understand what it is that you're looking for out of this to understand what the proper benchmarks need to be in place. And lastly, don't jump to conclusions. Understand apples and oranges. Geographies, service levels, volumes, compliance issues, customer orientation, all of these and more have an effect on the numbers and can be a reason why your performance metrics are lower than another companies within your industry. For example, if you're an organization that is heavily focused on customer service, that by definition means that people in the departments are going to spend more times with their customer, handle the issues a little differently, and therefore will in all likelihood have a lower transaction volume on a per day basis. So you need to account for that and say, well, my focus is here, not here, and determine which is the right set of values for you. Number 4, think win-win and strive for a mutually beneficial relationship. This is the cornerstone of an effective outsourcing partnership. Both parties should get what they need from the relationship. The customer needs high performance at a lower cost. The service provider needs a reasonable margin to deliver the expected results. In this case, you will get what you pay for. As part of a win-win mindset, the client organization needs to evolve from what it was before the outsourcing operation. The goal should be for the retained organization to focus on higher value activities. This is done in a variety of ways, but basically what we're saying here is when you make the transition to outsourcing, you're going to strip out activities that were being performed by internal staff, and the retained organization that's being left behind needs to change, needs to focus on doing different things and not worrying about all the transactional details and the oversight involved in that. That's the outsourcer's job. The job should be bringing more value into the organization by doing different things. So jobs are going to need to change. Functions and activities will get carved out, redistributed, and aligned. This is part of the process. It needs to be part of how you look at implementing an outsourcing solution. An operational link needs to be established between the outsourcing provider and the client organization. This means a strong governance model has to be established, and key roles are going to remain in the retained organization that manage the outsourcing relationship, as well as interfacing between the outsourced staff and the rest of the client organization. For example, there's going to be situations that occur where the outsourced organization is going to need some additional information than what they're being provided with. Very often there's a role within the retained organization that serves as kind of the interface between the outsourced organization and other departments within the company, facilitating that type of dialogue. That's a role that should continue to exist and needs to be established ongoing. And lastly, in all cases, you need to stay engaged. Black box outsourcing generally does not work, period. I define black box outsourcing as the type of outsourcing that occurs when you you transition a function to an outsourced provider. You're uninvolved in the process. They do the work and send you back a result. I very rarely see this work. I see this as a process that is fraught with risk because neither party truly understands what was involved before, and it's requiring both parties to do a lot to change. There needs to be a much more engaged, collaborative approach that takes place, and black box outsourcing, to me, is one that you should try to avoid. A recent Accenture report talked about how collaborative attitudes help to drive a successful outsourcing relationship. In the survey, 60% of the businesses that were surveyed said that they have a high degree of influence in setting the BPO direction. What this is basically telling you is when you transition a process to an outsourced provider, you don't absolve yourself of responsibility and let them do what they feel they need to do on their own. You need to stay involved, and you also need to affect the direction that it's going in. Your business is going to change. The outsourcing provider needs to respond to it. 90% of the businesses surveyed said that they work together with the service provider to resolve conflicts. That really can be applied to virtually every relationship, not just an outsourcing relationship, because basically if you're going to have a collaborative relationship with anyone, whether it's a friend, a spouse, a business associate, or a vendor and its customer, that you need to work together to resolve conflicts. Senior leadership working closely with each other to understand the strategies and objectives of the business. 73% of the companies surveyed said that this was a strong factor in a strong collaborative relationship. What this is basically telling you is at the beginning, senior leadership needs to define what it is that outsourcing is going to do for them and how it is aligned with and impacts the company's objectives and strategic initiatives. So usually you start with an operating vision that says, for example, I want my business to focus on core activities. I want to move the transactional activities to the service provider so we can focus on the core, and then I want the service provider to bring me best value, best practices, and higher value in that process. That's an example of how two organizations look to work together, and this becomes an evolving dynamic relationship because your strategies, your objectives are going to change, and the service provider needs to change along with it. From the service provider perspective, thinking win-win means committing to the relationship. Sorry about that one. It means committing to the relationship. There's no finger pointing. You can count on the fact that there will be resistance in the retained organization, whether it's passive or active. Either way, the outsourced provider needs the support of client management to make the relationship work. Thinking long-term rather than having a short-term memory is important too. Too often, once a transition occurs, the challenges that were resident in the former client organization becomes lost in the fog of memory. Kind of like the old girlfriend that you find on Facebook. You forget why you broke up with her in the first place, and she's looking pretty good in that picture. Lastly, there should be mutual incentives to improve performance. We often go with a gain share model where improvements that we initiate and invest in that result in lower costs to our client are split between the two organizations. In this way, we're incented to improve, and our client gets the benefit from our focus on lowering costs. So gain share is an important aspect that should be included in the operating model. Number 5, first seek to understand, then to be understood. Setting the proper expectations gets everything started on the right foot. A service level agreement is your tool to establish and manage expectations. Determining the timing, the activities, the quality, and other performance metrics, as well as how all of this is going to be communicated, reported on, and issues escalated and resolved are critical steps in the process. Understand that this will be a dynamic process and will change over time, and typically many of these metrics will not be defined until a true performance baseline is established. So having the right expectations around the timing of this is key as well when you finalize an agreement with your service provider. You may start with preliminary SLAs or a framework around it, but you're not going to have them finalized until several months after the transition has occurred. A vendor needs to be able to provide you with the basic core timing and volume, transaction volumes that you need to establish the operation, but this is going to change as the vendor gets more stable in its operation and the ability of it to perform at a higher level occurs. So the initial baseline is going to move to a service level that will evolve over time. It's also important to be prepared for the complexities of change. A recent survey from Deloitte showed that 63% of companies underestimated the level of involvement that was needed to manage an outsourcing relationship. It's an important point. Again, goes back to what we said before. Understand what you're getting yourself into and understand that you need to stay engaged. It's not something that you just transition and step out. And you're going to need to be involved, and having the right expectations around that is important. At the same time, 75% of service providers surveyed said their clients are not operationally prepared for an outsourcing initiative. That basically often has to do with the processes and the procedures in place, but it also has to do with the communication and the commitment. Service providers often experience a difficult transition because the client organization has not fully embraced this type of change. And understand that this does not end with the migration. However, once you're live, the relationship continues to evolve and grow. These key points will effectively guide both parties through the relationship ongoing. So I'd like to share them with you. Performance monitoring is a full-time commitment. So we typically do service level reviews on a monthly basis once we've kind of stabilized the operation, and this involves a report on the activities and the performance of the organization compared to the SLAs. Well, unfortunately, a lot of times what happens with these type of service level reviews is they become more rote and really not being paid a lot of attention to. So we report, we give the report, nobody really looks at what the report is saying unless there's a problem, and then a lot of actions are taking place. But sometimes problems don't crop up overnight. And if you review and track issues and understand their impact and determine if this is an ongoing issue, in other words, problem management versus incident management, you may be able to catch things before they become a major issue. So it's important to hold these sessions, to understand it, to communicate it, to use it as a vehicle, to have an ongoing dialogue, and to stay involved. Another important consideration is accountability is a two-way street. So when something happens, and there will be things that happen, understand that root causes of these issues and work together to address them. It's rare that an issue is purely one-sided. There are generally inputs on both sides. And working together to resolve them is the best way to make sure that these issues get addressed. There needs to be a focus on quality and continuous improvement. But the underlying drivers of quality and cost must first be understood. This goes back to baselining performance and understanding what your starting point are, what the goals are that you need to obtain, and that these are achievable and mutually beneficial. A service provider needs to have a focus on continuous improvement. It should be something that's even embedded in your contract with the service provider, that there's an ongoing focus around that, but it's not being done in a vacuum. They need to work together with you, and you need to challenge your service provider to make recommendations to how to improve a process, but you also need to be willing to change. And many times what we find is we identify opportunities, but it gets lost in the day-to-day transactional activity. Lastly, meeting regularly to align performance expectations with business needs is an important part of it. It circles back to the SLR, but there's really more. It's more than just a once-a-month meeting. There should be an ongoing dialogue. There really should be no surprises. The service provider needs to be part of the solution. Basically, you become roommates with each other, and everyone needs to understand what the house rules are in order to live effectively together. Habit number 6, synergize, work together to ensure success. As I mentioned, there will be issues on that you can count. How you deal with them will define the effectiveness of the outsourcing relationship. Often clients turn to hard controls to managing the outsourcing relationship. There are pros and cons to this approach. Hard controls, also known as service levels and penalties, are the standard operating procedure for an outsourcing provider. So typically what you find is you have certain metrics that you have to meet, and if you fail to meet those metrics within a certain threshold, there may be penalties involved to the service provider for lack of performance. The pro or positive aspect of this is that you will have clearly defined performance levels and accountability and what we call contractual control. It's one of the key benefits of an outsourcing relationship is the contractual control compared to you have some level of accountability, but it's a lot harder to get the performance within an internal organization up to standard. And even though you may have KPIs, there typically is no penalty for failing to meet those KPIs. In an outsourcing relationship, this contractual control goes to the next level. The negative side, however, of hard controls is that it really overemphasizes the legal and contractual positioning, and you spend a lot of time going back and forth on how to structure an SLA and what are the penalties involved, and you kind of lose sight about what you're really trying to accomplish. It creates an inflexible relationship as the service provider focuses on metrics and avoiding penalties, and not necessarily bringing value, and you often lose sight of the collaborative approach. Contrasting this to soft controls, also known as trust-based controls, is another way to look at this. Soft controls is not as commonly implemented, but it's starting to take hold, and it often is embedded, whether it's legislatively or not. It's often embedded within the outsourcing organization. Soft controls may mean things like flexibility on business rules or the ability to shift resources based on operational need. You give the service provider a little bit more leeway to do their job, to bring their experience into bear. But trust requires rules and governance, and sometimes this is a hard thing to accomplish. The positive about this is it reinforces the cooperative approach because now you're working more as a partner rather than a vendor. The negative side of it, however, is that it's challenging to measure and manage. You don't have the same level of measurements that say you've performed or you haven't performed. And frankly, the other negative about it is it requires trust. So it's often something that cannot be implemented right at the beginning. From the service provider perspective, we believe there should be a good balance between hard and soft controls. You do need clearly defined and realistic service levels to bring clarity and accountability to the relationship. An outsourced relationship by definition should mean collaboration and cooperation, which implies a need for trust and flexibility. But you need to give room to the service provider to be creative and to benefit from their experience, and realize that sometimes a mistake will happen. When it does, how you deal with it and how the service provider resolves it will mean more than holding their feet to the fire from a contractual perspective. You should empower the service provider to bring more value, offer improvements and efficiencies, not necessarily that are just tied to financial performance. A true partner will always look for ways to do just that. And lastly, you should personalize the relationship. This is a very important part of it because what happens very often is you have relationships that are kind of being done at an arm's length, and the two organizations don't necessarily have the same connection as if they were employees working in the same organization. Well, our operation is in Costa Rica, and we often have what I like to call the Costa Rica effect that takes place. Costa Rica is easy to get to, so often our clients will spend time down in our operations throughout the year so they can work more effectively with the team there. It's also a place that people don't necessarily have a problem going to and often want to go to, so it's not necessarily hard to get them to go to Costa Rica. But the side benefit that comes out of this is very often when they come into the organization in the first time, they don't know the people there, they don't necessarily have a good close relationship with them, and they don't necessarily view and treat them as if they would their own staff. But I always see by the end of that trip, relationships have been forged, people work together more effectively, it becomes a personalized relationship. You now know who that person is, there's a face to go with the name, and all of a sudden the relationship has evolved into a much closer working relationship. That type of effect, the personalization of the relationship, is a very valuable tool in making outsourcing work that much more effectively. Number 7, sharpen the saw, balance and renew your resources. When you transition to outsourcing, you're not replacing your employees with robots. They are real human beings at the other end of the line. While you're not responsible for their care and feeding, how you interact with them will have a big effect on how they perform. Yes, just like if they were your own employees. Don't forget this human side of the equation. From the service provider perspective, it's important to look for a provider that keeps this top of mind. The benefits of working in an outsourcing environment versus a captive organization are based on giving people opportunities to grow, develop, advance, and change. What we find is people get attracted to come to work in our organization. We have many people who've joined our organization who come out of large captive, what I mean by captive is shared services organizations, where they're in these large organizations and they really don't have the ability to grow and develop as quickly as they would like. Working in an environment like ours, we have a lot more flexibility, a lot more ability to adapt and move people through. They can do different things. They can work even for different clients and in different functions. And this is very attractive to people and helps them want to stay within our organization and not necessarily leave. So it helps us to manage some of the attrition that we have. You want to look for a service provider that invests in its people and helps to ensure service continuity. some of the key programs that can help to address employee concerns, and you should ask your service provider or prospective service provider about this if you're considering a relationship with them. Well, it starts with professional development, as I just mentioned. At the end of the day, you want to have the ability to move good people through the organization, give them more opportunities, even if that means moving them from one account to another account. As I've explained to my clients when I've done this move, and I'm very open about it, that they're making a move from one team to another. Our ability to service you is not about the bodies, it's not about the people necessarily, but it's about the overall service delivery. So I need to deliver a service. So if I move people through, I'm only going to do that when I know that there's not going to be an impact to service delivery to my current client. But if I am able to do that without impacting service delivery, I'm also giving somebody else an opportunity to do something that they want to do and grow and develop with us. Similarly, cross-training, the ability to have people work in different areas, different functions, even different industries that are important value add. Even cross-training within an account, so you can move good people from one function to another function and have them grow, not only grow and develop within the account, but also provide more value to that account is an important factor. Employee recognition, another thing that you want to understand how a service provider operates, because in the case of employee recognition, it's all about motivation and keeping people happy and rewarding their successes. You certainly want a service provider that has a competitive pay scale and benefits, so you want to understand where they stand compared to others in their market. And lastly, one that encourages a collaborative team building environment, one that focuses on that, does activities to encourage that team building. The culture that exists in the organization is just as important as how much you pay them and the type of jobs that they're doing. And we strive to establish a very strong, positive culture, and I think that's something that you need to find out about before you commit to any service provider. So as we've seen, Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, has been a touchstone for business executives for more than 20 years, and it also applies to the outsourcing industry. It can effectively serve both sides of the equation, the service provider and the customer, and give you a solid framework of how to establish and run a successful business operation. If it's done correctly, the operating environment that's created will be an extension of the businesses that create it. If both parties go into this enterprise with the goal of setting and creating a positive working environment and maintain that environment, a strong and effective partnership will emerge. And that, more than anything, is going to bring the value that both parties are seeking. I'd like to thank you all for your participation. For participating in this webinar, you have the ability to receive this presentation as well as a white paper that I've written on the topic. And anyone who does participate in the webinar can register for a no-cost opportunity scan, which will provide insight into potential opportunities that may be available from outsourcing your operations to Auxis. The opportunity scan is a simple process where you provide us with some information on the roles and functions you're interested in outsourcing, and we'll provide you with a report that shows what the potential cost savings could be and a high-level overview of how the operating model will work. As you can see on this page, there's some contact information for myself as well as Pedro Deval, and either one of us can help you get more information about opportunity scans. So thank you again, and now I'm going to open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Eric. We do have one question. The question is, do you recommend any methodologies such as Six Sigma or IDLE to manage and improve performance?
I recommend all of the above, but I recommend them within the context of the environment and the business that's going into it. So typically we employ a hybrid model. We don't necessarily adhere to every aspect of a Six Sigma methodology or an IDLE methodology, but we adapt it to the needs of our business. But all of these methodologies give you a strong focus on process, on performance, on efficiency, and continuous improvement. So all of those things give you the framework that help you be successful. So typically, in our case, depending upon the type of service that it is, elements of these methodologies will be employed.
Great, thank you, Eric. No, it looks like we have no other questions, so thank you, Eric, and to all of our participants for joining us today. Please watch for our follow-up email and along with the replay link and a copy of this presentation. Also, please take a moment to complete our brief exit survey. And on behalf of Eric and the Auxis team, we thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.